Our Steve Ryan spoke with the Deputy Ontario Fire Marshal. He'll join us with an update in moments.
Still no end in sight to Donald Trump's trade war. So Ottawa heads back with fresh retaliatory tariffs. The Foreign Affairs Minister says that this is going to be a day-to-day fight.
And the Premier meets with the incoming Prime Minister, Mark Carney. We'll tell you more about their conversation. We'll also look ahead to the Premier's upcoming trip to Washington.
Plus, a little bit of financial reprieve in the midst of an enormous amount of uncertainty. The central bank announces a rate cut.
You're watching Live at 5.
Good evening. I'm Bakari Savage.
And I'm Lena Latafat. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Live at 5. A mother and her 9-year-old daughter are dead after a house fire in Oshawa. Fire crews, they're still on scene and investigators are working to determine what happened.
Yeah, Steve Ryan is live at the scene. Steve, give us an update on the latest.
Well, I can tell you, Bakari and Lena, that the mood in this neighborhood is very somber. Neighbors are very sad as to the news that they are hearing throughout the day, and that is that 2 of their neighbors are now deceased as a result of this house fire. So Oshawa Fire tell us that they responded to this house fire at 8:08 this morning on McGregor Street in Oshawa. When they attended this location, the house was in flames. It was engulfed in flames. And they made entry and they rescued 3 people. An adult man had made his way out on his own, and there was a 46-year-old woman, a 12-year-old child, and a 9-year-old child. Those 3 people were taken out by Oshawa Fire, and sadly, as we were reporting, the mom and the 9-year-old have died as a result of the fire. The 12-year-old remains in hospital. Now, I did speak with the Oshawa Fire earlier on, and I spoke with the deputy of the Ontario Fire Marshal's office. Here's more from both those conversations. Let's listen.
So it's a very methodical scientific process that the investigators work through. The fire happened so quickly, and the investigation seems to be taking such a long time, but it is a very methodical process to ensure that we have the best level of understanding and evidence to ensure that we know how the fire started, and that we can use that information to create public safety messaging and ensure that everyone else doesn't have to experience an event like today.
You don't think you're starting your shift with something like this, and but when it does, you know, our guys, we all stick together, and the men and women here with Oshawa firefighters, yeah, we'll. It's not our first time that this has happened, and unfortunately, it won't be the last time. But we'll get through this. Yeah.
Side. So the deputy fire marshal said that they certainly are concerned about the structural integrity of this home. The investigators may rely on heavy equipment to assist them. And as you can see by the shot that we're showing you right now, the second floor of that house certainly has collapsed completely onto the main floor. So there is some concern about the integrity of this structure. So before the investigators can go in, they may need some help. I'll send it back to the desk.
Oh, just heartbreaking. Steve Ryan in Oshawa this evening. Thank you for this, Steve. To the trade war now. Ottawa continues its fight against Donald Trump's punishing tariffs. And today, that fight comes in the form of $30 billion in additional tariffs on American imports.
It's in response to levies on aluminum and steel. Right now, let's go live to CP24's Lindsay Biscaya, who joins us from the newsroom. Lindsay.
Yeah, and this is, of course, all these tariffs are going to hurt industries on both sides of the border. Lena and Bakari, we've already heard of reported job losses, layoffs really in the steel industry in Quebec. We know Algoma Steel also pausing shipments to the U.S. with this tariff and trade war ongoing. And no doubt, considering how much steel and aluminum the U.S. imports from many different countries, but also Canada, this is going to end up hurting Americans quite a bit, too. That's the message so many Canadian politicians, and including Premier Doug Ford, are trying to get across to the U.S. right now, is that this is going to hurt Americans. So this latest round of retaliatory tariffs from Canada to the U.S., that's going to take effect at 12:01, just after midnight tonight, at $30 billion, as you mentioned. That's about $12.6 billion in steel, if we're going to break it all down, $3 billion in aluminum, and another $14.2 billion in additional imported U.S. goods, such as computers, sports equipment, and other materials as well. We know that Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc is going to be heading down to Washington tomorrow with meetings with Howard Lutnick. Premier Doug Ford also joining him in those meetings as well. And Dominic LeBlanc has been very vocal, saying that this the latest meeting in Washington is really going to be focused on trying to lower the temperature when it comes to this trade war. Here's more from the minister himself.
I think it would be irresponsible not to take an opportunity to talk to Howard Lutnick about what we think is important to build a strong North American economy and why we think these continued tariff measures and the necessary and appropriate response that comes from Canada is not a constructive path to be on. If you're like racing to the basement, there's no real prize for being the first person to get to the basement. Like it doesn't feel like the path that we want to be on.
This is much more than about our economy. It is about the future of our country. Canadian sovereignty and identity are non-negotiable. Canadians have had enough, and we are a strong country. We will defend our sovereignty, we'll defend our jobs, and we'll defend our way of living. And we will do so all together every single day and one day at a time.
And when asked in the Oval Office today whether Donald Trump would actually respond to these retaliatory tariffs, he said that, of course, he would once again respond to them. Lena and Bakari, just didn't say when or how at this point. But we heard some really dark comments there coming from Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly. She also said that this is not just a fight for Canadian jobs and for Canadian families, but this is really a fight to avoid a possible takeover as well. So we're going to have to wait and see. It really seems to be changing moment by moment here. But that is the latest at this point. Back to you.
All right, reporting live from the newsroom, CP24's Lindsay Biscay. Lindsay, thank you. And the PM designate, Mark Carney, visited a steel plant in Hamilton this morning, and he talked about his approach to navigating this ongoing trade war.
We are ready to sit down with the Americans, with the U.S. government. I'm ready to sit down with President Trump at the appropriate time under a position where there's respect for Canadian sovereignty. And we're working for a common approach, a much more comprehensive approach for trade. We're all going to be better off. Workers here in Canada, which is our concern, workers in America, which is his concern. We are all going to be better off when the greatest economic and security partnership in the world is renewed, relaunched.
And all this tariff talk, that will continue tomorrow when Premier Doug Ford heads to Washington to talk with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick.
Okay, for the latest from Queen's Park, let's go live to CP24's Phil Perkins. Phil.
Yeah, the Bakari and Lena, well, Premier Doug Ford said yesterday that he just wants the temperature in these tariff talks to calm down. And today was definitely a lot more calm than the last couple of days. Back on Tuesday, Premier Ford giving retaliatory 25% surcharges on surplus electricity that Ontario sells to the U.S., particularly to Minnesota, Michigan, and New York. That would affect around 1.5 million homes there. Increase, electricity prices for those Americans by about $100 Canadian per month. And then out of retaliatory to that, President Trump threatening 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum. Ontario pulls out of the surcharge. America then brings that tariff back down to 25%. So today, a lot more calm. Premier Ford speaking with reporters a couple times as he was in between meetings. He left about an hour ago after meeting with some of the premiers there. As we mentioned a couple times now, he's on his way to D.C. tomorrow with Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc. That should be an interesting meeting after the $30 billion in retaliatory tariffs that LeBlanc announced today. So Premier Ford mapped out some of their itineraries, their goals with their meeting with the U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. We also heard from President Trump, who is meeting with the leader of Ireland, kind of recapping the drama from yesterday. Here's what both leaders had to say.
I want to find out where their bar is set. Rather than keep moving the goalposts, I want to find out how quickly you want to move forward and see what their requirements are, and then we can go back to Team Canada, as I call them, along with the Prime Minister, because make no mistake, it's going to be the federal government moving forward with this. But I think the premiers have a big say. All 13 premiers will have a big say how we move forward. But that's the most important thing, and build that relationship with their team.
We had a problem with Ontario, and they dropped that when I let them know what we were going to be doing. They dropped it immediately, so I'm glad, because electricity, you shouldn't be playing with electricity. It affects people's lives. They're actually their life. I mean, it can affect, depending on weather, it can affect their life. So we can't do that. And it doesn't make sense that our country allows electricity to be made in another country and sold into us. Who did that deal for the United States? Okay.
Yeah, and one of the deals, USMCA, that could be a topic between Mr. Lutnick and Premier Ford and Dominic LeBlanc as well. Also, just to show that cooler heads have prevailed a little bit, Premier Ford reacting to the president calling him a strong man. Premier Ford saying that he was grateful for the comment. So everyone at this point, copacetic. Back to you two.
All right, Phil Perkins live at Queen's Park. Thanks for this, Phil. Now from Queen's Park to Hamilton, because there is growing concern in that city known as a hub of Canada's steel industry. Mayor Andrea Horwath says if the tariffs remain in place for long, it is going to cost people in her city their livelihoods.
Whether it's the people who work in the quite diversified steel industry here in Hamilton, whether it's the business owners who are staring down serious decisions about whether or not to keep going, or whether it's just the people of Hamilton knowing that this, if it continues for any amount of time, even at the 25%, is going to cause negative ripple effects across our community. It is completely terrifying, to be frank.
These are very, very difficult times. I spent the last number of weeks speaking with members working broad-based industries that trade with the United States. And there is obviously a lot of concern, a lot of anxiety, but a lot of resolve. Workers understand that in order to get to a better place here, we have a fight on our hands, and Canada has to show strength.
The last time he was president, it was difficult. It's even more difficult this time. It's as if he's without any, there's no restraints on him. Last time there were more adults in the room around him. This time it's basically those who are his supporters, and nobody seems to have any kind of restraint on the president, which makes it very difficult for Canada, for Mexico, for the Europeans, for any country to negotiate with the United States.
Okay, it's 5:12. Let's check on the evening commute with CP24's traffic specialist, Adjoa Intia Yeboah. Adj, good evening.
Oh, good evening, Bakari and Lena. It continues to be quite the slow afternoon on the major routes, and just checking out that drive on the Gardner westbound as you try to get out of the downtown core. Definitely running into delays there as you head from just before Jarvis out towards the Dufferin stretch. Northbound Don Valley Parkway, still busiest, approaching Bayview Bloor, continues jammed up towards the 401. Southbound a little bit busy over the 401 down towards the Winford Drive stretch. And you know what? Was watching a problem was on the 401 westbound through Winston Churchill. It was a stall. It did have the right lane blocked. Just watch that vehicle clear the scene. I'll send it back to you both.
This CP24 traffic report is brought to you by 407 ETR. Enjoy the journey with a stress-free commute.
Thank you, Adjoa. It's 5:13, sitting right at the freezing mark, and you're watching Live at 5.
So up next, we're going to have more of a violent carjacking in Toronto. The police takedown, it was all caught on camera. Toronto police say that 3 teenagers have been arrested in connection with a violent carjacking. They've released this inside look at the takedown.
Looks like he's pulling into a parking lot here.
Police say a vehicle was carjacked at knife point by a lone suspect in the Victoria Park and Shepherd area on Saturday night. Shortly after, police located the vehicle and saw more suspects get into it. Police followed it to a parking lot near Nielsen Road and Ellesmere Road, where they boxed it in, and 3 suspects got out and tried to run away. Police caught up with them and say 3 boys, aged 16 and 17, were taken into custody.
And police have released images of a suspect wanted for 3 robberies at downtown stores.
Investigators are searching for this man, described as 20 to 30 years old, 5'8", with a medium build. Police say between December 5th and December 11th of last year, the suspect robbed stores near Bloor and Ossington, Bloor and Sherbourne, and College and Lansdowne. Police say in each case, the suspect entered the store, approached the checkout with a handgun, and made a demand for cash. The suspect should be considered armed and dangerous. If you see him, don't approach him. Just call 911 immediately.
A Toronto woman who faced multiple charges in a dog attack that seriously injured a child has pleaded guilty to negligence.
Court records show Patricia Siarek entered the pleas in a Toronto court last Friday. She was also charged with infractions under the Provincial Dog Owners Liability Act and Toronto's Municipal Code. She was arrested last March after an off-leash dog bit and dragged a child in a city park, leaving them with life-altering injuries. Court documents in a separate case show Siarek previously sparked several complaints at a condo over the behavior of her dogs, who were labeled dangerous by the city.
And Toronto police are saying sorry after officers appeared to credit the October 7th terror attack on Israel with leading more people to embrace Islam while recording a podcast for the service.
Through social media, a lot of people after October 7th started learning about Islam.
Toronto police issued a statement, and that says, we acknowledge that our recent episode of our podcast, Project Olive Branch, has caused significant upset and concern in the Jewish community and beyond. That was not our intention, and we apologize. The podcast has been removed. The chief of police, Myron Demkew, has ordered a review of our procedures and content to ensure it aligns with our commitment to respectful and inclusive engagement while maintaining impartiality.
And a statement from Chief Demkew says, quote, we recognize the Jewish community's profound pain and anguish as a result of the October 7th attack and the ensuing rise of anti-Semitism. I've personally heard from the community about the impact of this podcast, and I'm truly sorry. Our commitment to protecting our Jewish communities remains unwavering.
Well, Toronto Public Health is investigating a case of measles linked to an international flight that landed at Pearson International Airport earlier this month.
Yeah, TPS says anyone who was on board Air Canada flight AC002 from Tokyo to Toronto March 2nd may have been exposed. Health officials say anyone who was in Terminal 1 at Pearson between 4:50 and 7:30 that evening, the same day, you're also at risk of exposure.
It is 5:18 now, sitting right at the freezing mark, and you're watching Live at 5.
The Bank of Canada drops its interest rate again, but has a warning about the future amid the trade war. We're going to hear from Governor Tiff Macklem next.
Welcome back. The Bank of Canada has cut its benchmark interest rate by 1/4 point to 2.75% as tariff announcements shake business and confidence.
Now, this is the 7th consecutive rate reduction by the central bank, and officials say that they're going to proceed carefully with any further reductions, warning of a possible new crisis that could be caused by the Trump administration's tariffs. And Canada's key rate has now fallen 2.25% in the last 9 months.
We ended 2024 on a solid economic footing. We are now facing a new crisis. Depending on the extent and duration of new U.S. tariffs, the economic impact could be severe. The uncertainty alone is already causing harm. Monetary policy cannot offset the impacts of a trade war. What it can and must do is ensure that higher prices do not lead to ongoing inflation.
And Alan Small, Senior Investment Advisor from Alan Small Financial Group, joined us with more on today's interest rate decision.
I think everyone was anticipating a 1/4 point cut, a gradual reduction of interest rates. I think it's all hands on deck, right? With what's going on south of the border, we just heard about what we're going to be doing here, putting tariffs on goods, on U.S. goods. And I think it's a Team Canada approach, right? Bank of Canada is going to do what they can do to help business, to help our economy, lowering rates, trying to be as stimulative as possible with inflation running in and around 2%.
And Phil Soper, President and CEO of Royal LePage, joined us with more on what the rate decision means for the housing market.
It's going to make homes more affordable. As a matter of fact, we've been through a period of 2.5 years now where home prices have been stable, or in, for example, the 416 in Ontario actually declined a bit. The cost of borrowing has gone down and wages and salaries have increased. So it's not often, if you look back over the last 50 years, that housing actually gets more affordable in Canada and in Southern Ontario, but that's what's happening.
And the big banks usually follow suit. They have responded by matching the Bank of Canada's rate cut effective tomorrow. The prime rate at the banks will be 4.95%. That's a decrease of 1/4 percentage point.
And Canada's hosting a meeting of G7 foreign ministers from today until Friday. This is ahead of the summit, which is happening in Charlevoix, Quebec. We actually heard from U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He was asked about tariffs and threats to Canadian sovereignty made by Trump. Here's what he said.
He says if they became the 51st state, we wouldn't have to worry about the border and fentanyl coming across because now we would be able to manage that. He's made an argument that it's their interest to do so. Obviously, the Canadians don't agree, apparently. But
do you agree with this? Should they be ever going to discuss that, becoming the 51st?
Well, that's not what we're going to discuss at the G7, and that's not what we're going to be discussing in our trip here. So they're the host nation, and I mean, we have a lot of other things we work on together. We defend North America through NORAD and the airspace of our continent together. So not to mention the issues of Ukraine and other commonalities. So we're going to be focused in the G7 on all of those things. That's what the meeting is about. It is not a meeting about how we're going to take over Canada.
G7 foreign ministers are expected to focus on Ukraine and the Middle East, but I'm sure there will be some trade talk for sure.
It's 5:24, holding at 0. This is Live at 5.
Well, coming up, we are less than a year away from the Winter Olympics, and now we know who will be leading Team Canada. Stay with us.
Well, the Raptors will wrap up a 4-game homestand tonight when they host the Philadelphia 76ers.
Toronto is coming off a 119-104 victory over the Washington Wizards on Monday. A.J. Lawson had a big night for the Raps, becoming just the third Canadian in NBA history to record a 30-plus point double-double off the bench. Toronto's won 4 of its last 5, looking good. Tip-off for this evening's contest, that is set for 7:30 at Scotiabank Arena.
Okay, we're less than a year away from the 2026 Milano Cortina Winter Olympics, and now we know who's going to be Team Canada's chef de mission at the Games.
Olympic champion freestyle skier Jennifer Heel will lead the Canadian delegation. She made history at her Olympic debut at Salt Lake City in 2002. She went on to win gold in Turin in 2006 and silver in Vancouver in 2010 before retiring from the sport. She spoke to CP24 about her new position.
The mental burden is one of the biggest. And so I see my role really as clearing the pathway for the athletes, taking some of those distractions off their plate, speaking to the media on behalf of Team Canada, things like that, and then dealing with issues behind the scenes as they arise. But for me, I really want to share the message with the athletes around being adaptable. I think that's necessary for everyone in 2025 going into 2026. But also not forgetting the joy. And so, there wasn't one performance that I had that was great without joy. And so it doesn't mean every day's fun, but it means, embracing that journey.
The 2026 Winter Games begin February 6th next year.
You're watching Live at 5 on Toronto's Breaking News, CP24.
A 46-year-old woman and her 9-year-old daughter, they're dead after being pulled from a burning home in Oshawa today. And her other daughter is fighting for her life. We'll get an update live from the scene coming up. A fire in Oshawa has claimed the life of a mom and her 9-year-old daughter. Our Steve Ryan just talked with the Deputy Ontario Fire Marshal. He's going to join us with an update in moments.
Still no end in sight to Donald Trump's trade war, so Ottawa hits back with fresh retaliatory tariffs. The Foreign Affairs Minister says this is going to be a day-to-day fight.
And the Premier meets with the incoming Prime Minister Mark Carney. We're going to tell you more about their conversation. And we'll also look ahead to the Premier's upcoming trip to Washington.
Plus, a little bit of financial reprieve in the midst of an enormous amount of uncertainty. The central bank announces a rate cut. What does that mean for you?
This is Live at 5.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Lena Latafat.
And I'm Bakari Savage. A mother and her 9-year-old daughter, they're dead after a house fire in Oshawa. Fire crews are still on the scene. They're working to determine what happened.
And our Steve Ryan is live at the scene this evening. Steve, tell us more about what you're learning.
I can tell you, Lena, that the neighbors are absolutely heartbroken at the news when they heard today that a mom and one of her daughters died in this early morning fire. Oshawa Fire tell us that they responded to this house fire at 8:08 this morning on McGregor Street in Oshawa. There were 4 people in the house, an adult male, an adult female, and a 12-year-old and a 9-year-old. The adult male, we were told, was able to make his way out of the house on his own, and the other 3 people had to be rescued by Oshawa Fire. And sadly, as we've been reporting, the 46-year-old mom and 9-year-old daughter have both died as a result of the fire, and the 12-year-old is still in the critical condition in the hospital. Now, this is an investigation that will be conducted by the Ontario Fire Marshal's Office because they are mandated to do so anytime there is a death, and the OFM will determine the cause, origin, and circumstances of the fire. Now, earlier on, I did speak with a deputy fire marshal, and I spoke with Oshawa Fire as well, and here is some of those conversations. Let's listen.
On behalf of the Fire Marshal's Office, I would like to express our heartfelt condolences to the tragic events here today and to everyone who's been affected by that. Our office is here now starting their preliminary investigation. We are evaluating for structural stability and ensuring that it will be safe for our investigators to go in. Oshawa Fire remains on scene here as well to look for hot spots and conduct a fire watch.
We arrived at around 8:12 to find a fully involved house fire, and people were directing us that there were still 3 occupants inside. Crews made a rapid entry through the second-story window and the first floor, main floor door. They got water on the fire quickly. After doing a rapid search, we brought out 3 victims. 2 have been pronounced, and 1 is at sick kids now.
Now, there is some concern with regards to the structural integrity of this house. As you can see, the second floor has completely collapsed onto the main floor. So the deputy fire marshal said that they may bring in some extra heavy equipment to assist the investigators as they determine the cause, origin, and circumstances surrounding this fire. I'll send it back to the desk.
Okay. CP24's crime analyst, Steve Ryan in Oshawa. Thank you. Okay, to the trade war now. Ottawa continues its fight against Donald Trump's punishing tariffs, and today that fight comes in the form of $30 billion in additional tariffs on American imports.
It's in response to levies on aluminum and steel. Let's go live to CP24's Lindsay Biscaya, who's standing by with more on what federal officials had to say about this today. Lindsay.
Well, these retaliatory tariffs going into effect just after midnight tonight. So as you both mentioned, this is in response to the 25% tariffs that came into effect on steel and aluminum for Canada. There were also tariffs on steel and aluminum for other countries as well yesterday from the U.S. This, of course, is going to hurt the industry, the steel and aluminum industry here in Canada quite hard. It's kind of reminiscent of those tariffs that President Trump put in last time he was in office. But of course, this is higher. 25% is what we're talking about. And we're already seeing companies dealing with layoffs. We're seeing Algoma Steel pausing shipments to the U.S. So already some effects coming in. But these counter tariffs are going to hit Americans quite hard. That, of course, is the point. You mentioned $30 billion, but if we break it down further, that's $12.6 billion in steel, $3 billion in aluminum, and then $14.2 billion in additional imported U.S. goods. The latest from Minister of Export Promotion, International Trade, Mary Ng, is that she said Canada is seeking formal consultations with the U.S. regarding these tariffs on steel and aluminum. Haven't heard back on that yet, but at the same time, we know that Dominic LeBlanc is heading down to Washington tomorrow to speak with Howard Lutnick. Premier Doug Ford will also be joining him. And the idea behind this meeting, of course, is to continue these negotiations on this trade war. And Dominic LeBlanc was saying today that the real goal here is to lower the temperature. Here's more.
We've always said the best approach is a coherent conversation that looks at all of these issues where the 3 economies are part of the conversation and where we can arrive at the best agreement for North America. That's been the success of previous conversations. But for the moment, it's difficult to get there because day over day, week over week, you have these decisions. So if we can sort of clear the underbrush and get to a position where we can get to April 2nd with a coherent plan, I certainly think that would be the objective of the conversation tomorrow. And it continues on conversations we've been having over recent weeks as well.
We need to provide certainty. What I hear from folks is that this is now the Far West on the factory floor. We can operate an economy like that. We cannot operate a country like that. The industry cannot stand that for many more weeks. So the mission we're going to have is to restore certainty, stability, and predictability. Because you know what? What is happening, and just look at the market reaction to what has been happening. It's making us less competitive, less attractive, and certainly this is not the time, at a time where national security is at the forefront, that we weaken our competitiveness.
And we heard the two ministers there talking about certainty, and that's kind of the problem here, is the uncertainty is really causing some turmoil within the markets for Canadian businesses as well. In general, for Canadians, the uncertainty is really what's hurting us as well. And we also heard from Donald Trump today in the Oval Office. He was asked whether he would respond to these retaliatory tariffs with potentially more tariffs, and he said for sure that's not out of the question. Lena, Bakari?
All right, Lindsay Biscaya reporting live tonight. Thank you, Lindsay. And the PM designate, Mark Carney, visited a steel plant in Hamilton this morning and spoke about his approach to navigating this ongoing trade war.
We are ready to sit down with the Americans, with the U.S. government. I'm ready to sit down with President Trump at the appropriate time under a position where there's respect for Canadian sovereignty. And we're working for a common approach, a much more comprehensive approach for trade. We're all going to be better off. Workers here in Canada, which is our concern, workers in America, which is his concern. We are all going to be better off when the greatest economic and security partnership in the world is renewed, relaunched.
Well, the tariff talk will continue tomorrow when Premier Doug Ford heads to Washington. That's what talk tariffs with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick.
And for the latest from Queen's Park, we're live to CP24's Phil Perkins. It's been a busy week for the Premier. He sat down with Mark Carney today.
Yeah, he did, Lena and Bakari, the Premier's team, sharing some photos. It looks like Mark Carney had a lot of coffee today, because I've seen a lot of photos today of the Prime Minister-designate having meetings with several politicians over coffee. This one with at a diner with Premier Ford, who, in a way, has been the voice of Canadians during this tariff war. He's been on numerous American network TV, speaking on behalf of Canadians, talking about everything from these tariffs to what Ontario will personally be doing back on Tuesday, this 25% surcharge on over surplus electricity that we sell to the states. That has since been rescinded, but according to the Premier today, that is still not off the table. They're doing that in good faith ahead of their trip to Washington, D.C. to speak with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. Ontario also going to be pulling those Ontario First ads that are being broadcast in the U.S. again out of good faith. He will be joined with Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc, which will be a very interesting confrontation with Mr. Lutnick, seeing that Canada just announced $30 billion in retaliatory tariffs against the U.S. And they'll also be speaking about the USMCA, which ironically was created after Donald Trump in his first term threatened to just scrap NAFTA. So they renegotiated that. We have the USMCA, and so they're going to see, what they need to revise to make everybody happy. Premier Ford also, though, talked about from here on out, basically, this is going to be a federal issue. Speaking of Mark Carney, the PM designate, he will be taking this forward, speaking with Trump one-on-one. And Ford mentioned what the relationship between the two leaders will be like compared to the outgoing Prime Minister in Justin Trudeau. Now, we also heard from Trump himself, kind of recapping what happened yesterday. Here's what both leaders had to say.
It's going to be a better relationship than with Prime Minister Trudeau, and no disrespect to Prime Minister Trudeau. I can tell you one thing, Mark Carney is extremely astute business mind. He understands numbers, and so does President Trump and Secretary Lutnick. I think they're going to get along very well. They both come from the same financial sectors.
We had a problem with Ontario, and they dropped that when I let them know what we were going to be doing. They dropped it immediately, so I'm glad, because electricity, you shouldn't be playing with electricity. It affects people's lives. Actually their life. I mean, it can affect, depending on weather, it can affect their life, so we can't do that. And it doesn't make sense that our country allows electricity to be made in another country and sold into us. Who did that deal for the United States? Okay.
So Premier Ford going to be leaving for D.C. tomorrow with Dominic LeBlanc. We'll get the highlights of that, of course. Stick it with CP24, and we'll let you know what was discussed. Back to you two.
All right. All eyes on that meeting in Washington. Thanks so much for this, Phil. Well, the president and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce says there are no winners in this trade war.
When you look at what Canada exports to the U.S. inputs a lot from Canada. 70% of that is stuff to make other stuff in the U.S. So when you're thinking about a trade policy that's trying to bolster manufacturing and bring back jobs to the U.S., Canada's the #1 partner for that. And we're the best customer of the US as well. And we import a lot of goods from the US. So I think what is so important right now, and the business community is very active on this, is making sure the integration of our supply chains, how that serves the manufacturing and jobs on both sides of the border.
Jacques Shore, government affairs partner at the law firm Gowling WLG, joined us with more insight into Canada's response to the ongoing trade war.
The upper hand for this moment, I think, continues to be the United States simply because we have relied so heavily on this exceptionally fantastic relationship that we have. But we do have, I think, in our toolkit, a number of mechanisms in place, tools in place, to actually demonstrate to the Americans that this is going to hurt them as well. I hate the idea of saying we have to hurt them. And I think repeatedly, as we've heard, Premier Ford say, look, we don't want to hurt Americans, but we do want to obviously address this in a very serious way.
Right now, because of all the uncertainty, I think a lot of people are just trying to remain like business as usual. Even back in 2018 when this happened, a lot of the time, like, it's the same amount of activity, cross-border transaction. It costs a lot more. So I think for now, we're going to see what these costs make. And I guess the longer that this happens, the longer this goes down, basically will make things worse for both countries.
5:43, 0 outside. Typically, this time of day, we're seeing a lot of volume on the road. CP24's traffic specialist, Adjoa Nsiayabwa, has a look at your latest commute. Is that the case today, too, Adj?
Yeah, a lot of problems and a lot of big delays because of these problems. We'll start with these issues that I've been watching on the eastbound lanes of the 401 in the collectors at Victoria Park. It's just the left lane getting by following this multi-vehicle crash. And then if you're on the 401 westbound, a collision involving 2 transport trucks, westbound 401 Express at Dufferin, right lane occupied. Also problems impacting the drive on the westbound 403 in the collectors. Just as you make your way through Eglinton, you'll find that left lane blocked in QEW, Niagara bound through Dorval. Left lane out with the collision. Big problems I can't see. They're happening out through Oshawa on the 401 westbound. This is just past Stevenson Road. All lanes blocked at Stevenson following a serious collision involving a motorcycle. They are forcing traffic off at Stevenson Road. So it's a busy afternoon. I'll send it back to both of you.
All right. Thanks, Adj.
You're welcome.
It's 5:44, holding at 0. This is Live at 5.
Coming up, the Bank of Canada cut its benchmark interest rate by 1/4 point as it warns trade uncertainty is already hurting the Canadian economy. We'll be right back. This just into CP24. We're following developing news from our nation's capital tonight. Sources tell CTV News that Prime Minister-designate Mark Carney will be sworn in on Friday along with his cabinet at Rideau Hall in Ottawa. Mark Carney's obviously going to make some crucial decisions. He's got to decide who's going to make up his cabinet. And then, of course, the big question will be, when will he call that election? But again, we're following a bit of breaking news from Ottawa this hour, where we're learning that Mark Carney will be sworn in along with his cabinet on Friday. We'll, of course, have extensive coverage of that. Well, the Bank of Canada has cut its benchmark interest rate by 1/4 point.
Yeah, this is as tariff announcements shake business and confidence. So this is the 7th consecutive rate reduction by the central bank, and officials say that they're going to proceed carefully with any further reductions, warning of possible new crisis, which could be caused by the Trump administration's tariffs. Now, Canada's key rate, it's now fallen 2.25% in the last 9 months.
Inflation has remained close to the 2% target. The temporary GST-HST holiday has lowered some consumer prices, but January inflation came in a little firmer than expected at 1.9%. Inflation is forecast to increase to about 2.5% in March with the end of the tax break.
Phil Soper, President and CEO of Royal LePage, joined us with more on what the rate decision and the ongoing trade war means for the housing market.
Existing homeowners who say need to move, but they don't need to move urgently, are actually listing their homes. The number of homes listed in Canada, right across the country, has climbed considerably. But what they're not doing is the typical housing shortage in Canada approach of listing, selling, and then looking for a home, because the big challenge used to be, gosh, what if I sell my house and I can't find another one? Now they're waiting for their current house to sell before they commit to buying something, and it's created something of an impasse, a standoff in the market.
And the big banks, have responded by matching the Bank of Canada rate cut. Effective tomorrow, the prime rate at the banks will be 4.95%. That's a decrease of a quarter percentage point.
You're watching Live at 5 on Toronto's breaking news, CP24.
And the trade war with the U.S., it's causing Canadian pride to increase. We'll tell you what people are saying coming up.
Welcome back. A new Leger poll suggests Canadians' sense of national pride has surged in response to Donald Trump's tariffs and threats against this country's sovereignty.
Okay, for a closer look at this, we're joined by Jack Jedwab, president of the Association for Canadian Studies. That's the group that commissioned the study. So when looking at this, okay, we have the national pride that's gone up. The more interesting thing is that it's larger in older people than younger people.
Yeah, that's not unusual. That's been pretty much a common trend that we've seen in previous polling that looks at sense of belonging, attachment, or pride to Canada. In part, I think, because younger people are not as engaged with Canada, and as they get older, the level of pride or sense of belonging rises. But in this most recent poll, it kind of flattened out where, okay, there still were those gaps, but they're not as wide as they usually are. So we're seeing a fairly large swath of Canadians on the bandwagon in terms of their feeling of pride to Canada, which clearly has surged relative to previous polling we've done.
Yeah, one of the biggest takeaways here is that Canadian pride has risen from 80 to 86% now. It also appears that Canadians are taking Donald Trump's threats to annex Canada more seriously. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, clearly the polls suggest that a majority of Canadians take these threats quite seriously. And I think that also has contributed to this strong reaction we're seeing because for many Canadians, this has become a very existential issue. Sort of it's an attack on our identity, on our sense of being Canadian, and a reminder that we shouldn't take our country for granted, that, which is something we sometimes do. But now we're seeing this strong resurgence, including in the province of Quebec, which is not known for those high levels of pride. But it's as though a lot of Quebecers, including younger Quebecers, according to the poll, have discovered their inner Canadian.
Okay, so along with that, the poll also found little support for Canadian statehood in the U.S.
Right. I mean, in the U.S. At this point, we're not seeing a lot of desire for annexation amongst the population there. It's not something we've polled about. We're polling in Canada, and Canadians certainly outrightly reject any such idea. But by and large, in terms of some of the American surveys, I've seen one in February done by Gallup. Americans have a really good feeling about Canadians, which is interesting because our poll is also showing a new low relative to Canadians' feelings about the United States, putting them in very negative territory in terms of their perception. 15 points ahead of the perception about Russia, but usually the United States is 50 points ahead of our perception about Russia. So the United States has really fallen in favor amongst Canadians, though we're making distinction with Americans. So we still have a positive feeling for the most part about Americans. It's right now about the United States and largely about Donald Trump.
Yeah, so much national unity and pride. That's about the only good thing coming out of this. Jack Jedwab, president of the Association for Canadian Studies, the group that commissioned this study that we're talking about. Thanks for your time, Jack. We appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
It's 5:55, holding at 0. This is Live at 5.
Coming up next, we'll tell you why Burlington is closing a section of road for a certain animal. Stay with us.
Burlington has closed a section of road to help protect endangered salamanders.
Yeah, King Road is shut down from North Service Road to Mountain Brow Road. That is to prevent Jefferson salamanders from being run over as they migrate to their spring breeding ponds. The closure has been made every year since 2012, and it'll be in place until April 9th. Got to protect the salamanders.
Well, that was a very special moment for a family in California who thought that their cat had died in the Palisades wildfire.
Yeah, this is an incredible story. Aggie the cat had been missing for 2 months following that devastating wildfire. Her family thought she didn't make it until they received a call from Animal Services telling them Aggie had been found near her home. While Aggie needed some specialized care, she is expected to return home tomorrow. What a great ending to that story.
All right, it's 5:59, holding at 0. This is Toronto's Breaking News, CP24.
Thanks so much for joining us this evening. CTV News at 6 is next.